Melanie Phillips is a British journalist and author, best known for her column about political and social issues, which currently appears in the Daily Mail newspaper. Ms. Phillips is a regular panellist on the BBC Radio 4 programme, The Moral Maze. After a short period at the New Society magazine, she joined The Guardian newspaper in 1977 and soon became its social services correspondent and a social policy leader writer. After a stint as the paper's news editor, she started writing her own opinion pieces in 1987. Leaving The Guardian, Ms. Phillips first took her opinion column to The Observer and then to the Sunday Times before starting to write regularly for the Daily Mail in 2001. She has used her Daily Mail column and her blog regularly for, amongst other issues, progressive teaching methods, writing about progressive teaching methods, Islamism, anti-Semitism, as well as to defend Israel. Ms. Phillips was awarded the Orwell Prize for Journalism in 1996. Her most notable book, before Londonistan, has been All Must-Have Prizes, published in 1996. The book offered a detailed critique of the British education system, claiming that an egalitarian and non-competitive ethos had led to a catastrophic fall in standards. In 2003, she published The Ascent of Woman, a history of the suffragette movement. She lives in London and is married to Joshua Rosenberg, formerly the legal affairs correspondent for the BBC and now the legal editor of the Daily Telegraph newspaper. And they have 2 children. And one little aside that may interest you, something Melanie did not tell me, is that in 2003 she was nominated in the category of Most Islamophobic Media Personality at the annual Islamophobia Awards. And that's a great credential that she can boast. It's my great pleasure and honour to present to you Melanie Phillips.
Thank you very much indeed, Avi. I just want to make sure everybody can hear me, because this microphone, like so many microphones, seems to have a life of its own. Can everybody hear me if I speak like this? That's very good. If you said no, I would have a problem. It's a great pleasure to be here to speak to you this evening, and thank you very much for having me. I'm going to speak for a while about the issues arising from my book, Londonistan. And then there will be time for questions afterwards, and I hope that we will have a discussion about some of the issues and themes that arise from what I have to say to you. I'm speaking about the situation in Britain, but I think it's particularly relevant and important to people in America, not simply because Britain is America's most important ally, but because there are many similarities between our countries. There are many significant differences, and we might like to explore those too. But there are many similarities, and some of the things that I'm talking about that are happening in Britain that are causing me concern, I know are happening here too, because many of you have told me that since my book was published here last May, and it was published shortly after that in the United Kingdom. I wrote the book Londonistan as a warning, because I believed that Britain was very deeply in denial about the threat of radical Islam to the free world. And because it was in denial, it was unlikely to be able to fight this thing properly, and was indeed in danger of becoming a weak link in the alliance to defend the free world. And despite a shift in the public mood over the last few months, indeed since my book was published, and I will talk about that shift in a moment, I believe that is still the case. I believe Britain is still very much in denial about the nature, extent, and significance of the jihad against the free world, and particularly the West. Now, you may be wondering about this term Londonistan. It was a term of abuse coined by the French Secret Service, it is popularly believed, for a Britain that during the 1990s had allowed itself, remarkable as it may seem, to become the most important centre in Europe, the European hub of Al-Qaeda, and that's a story in itself. The term Londonistan is a neologism, London as in the capital of Britain. The Istan bit refers mockingly to, it's a mocking reference to Afghanistan, where Al-Qaeda was notoriously trained, and therefore the word Londonistan was a very neat way of encapsulating the fact that Britain had become the centre of Al-Qaeda. But I call the book Londonistan not simply because I was describing how that remarkable situation had come about, but because, to me, Londonistan is also a state of mind. It's a state of mind where people not only seek to appease, but come to believe and absorb, to a certain extent, some of the obnoxious ideas and assumptions of the very enemy that intends to destroy them. It's a state of mind, in my view, that applies not just in Britain, not just in Europe, but also to elements in America and to Israel. Throughout the free world, people, in my view, are refusing to accept that we are in the throes of a holy war waged upon the Western world, I would suggest for the past 25 years. With Israel, you might think the proxy target well before that, without even recognizing that it is a war, because it doesn't fit our definition of war, and with significant numbers, as I've just suggested, actually assimilating some of the lies of the enemy's propaganda, which of course greatly weakens our ability to defend ourselves. Now, the Islamists have been extremely clever. They realized long ago something that we in the West still haven't got our heads around. They understood that the way to achieve their goals was principally through the power of ideas. Terrorism was merely the tactic. The strategy was to conquer. I think that the phrase war against terror is singularly inappropriate. You can't have a war against terror. Terror is merely a tactic. It's a mechanism. The thing that we face, the thing that threatens us, is much bigger than terror. It's actually the ideas, the ideology that are driving people to these terrible acts. But what the Islamists realized was that the power of ideas was absolutely central to their goals. And once they had conquered people's minds, an empire would follow. If they colonized the human mind to the cause of lies, hatred, of paranoia, of vicious prejudice, and a story about the world which was false, but which incited people to irrational hysteria, then they would have an army. And that army would grow the more the propaganda of lies could be perpetrated in order to recruit yet more. And if they further were able to confuse and paralyze, to a certain extent, the minds of their designated victims to demoralize them, then they would win. And what I'm concerned about is that we are allowing them to do precisely that, and we are doing it by denying what we are up against and not understanding the battleground that we should be fighting on. And we deny that, principally, this is a war of religion being waged against us. We deny it because we are paralyzed by our belief in multiculturalism and minority rights, which has come to mean we can't criticize a minority faith without accusing ourselves of being racist. Now, I stand very firmly against racism and all forms of bigotry. And I think it's very important, and I know there are some people who will not agree with me on this, but I feel it to be true, and it's very important to say this, that there are many Muslims in Britain and in America and in Europe and in the world who are genuinely, deeply opposed to what is being perpetrated in the name of their religion, and who genuinely wish to live in peace and harmony with other cultures. It's also important to remember that most victims of radical Islamism around the world, the kind of Islamism that is perpetrating jihad or holy war, most of the victims are indeed Muslims. And I believe that there are a number of extremely brave Muslims in around the world who are speaking up, trying to provoke a reformation within Islam. Whether or not they will succeed is not a matter for me to pass an opinion on, but they are trying. They are standing up for freedom, and we are not doing enough to support them, and I think we should be doing very much more. Now, having said that, Britain has a very, very serious problem of radicalized Muslims. Homegrown British Muslims, born and bred in Britain, who are nevertheless recruited to the jihad and who wish to murder as many of their fellow British citizens as possible. And this is a very terrible thing for Britain to come to terms with. And we first realized that we had this phenomenon on 7/7, on July the 7th, 2005, when you will recall British-born Muslims turned themselves into suicide bombs and blew up the London Underground and a London bus and murdered more than 50 British people and injured many more. And a couple of weeks later, another group tried to do the same. Actually, they failed, and they are currently on trial. Now, when this terrible thing happened, many in Britain really did not wish to face up to what this was actually about. And they came up with a whole set of excuses and alibis to explain how it could be that Britain, a free society, tolerant, decent, multicultural, had produced boys who wished to murder as many of their fellow British citizens as possible. And they told themselves that it was all because of the war in Iraq, or because British Muslims were living in segregated communities, and because they were living in segregated communities, these communities were hostile to Britain and the West. Well, that clearly couldn't have been the case, because the 7/7 bombers actually went to ordinary British schools and to university, where, in fact, many British Muslims are radicalized for the first time on British campuses. When they leave their, in quotes, segregated communities, the Muslim communities, and go to British universities, that's where they become radicalized. And this delusion, among many others, is because what Britain and other Western faint hearts fail to grasp is that the greatest single driver of Islamic terrorism is not poverty, it's not discrimination, it's not Islamophobia, it's not segregation. It is simply terrorism, or to be more precise, the demoralized reaction to it. It's the fact that terrorism works. And I will talk about that more in a moment. Go back for a moment to the war that we are facing. As I say, it is a jihad, it is a holy war, and I believe it is a world war being fought in many disparate theatres around the world with many different causes, but all with one single coherent aim: to defeat Western civilization, to establish Islam as the dominant power in the world, and to restore the medieval Islamic caliphate or empire. Looking back, it seems to me very clear that this started in 1979 when Ayatollah Khomeini established his theocracy in Iran and at the same time declared his intention to subjugate the world to Islam, to wage war upon the West and subjugate it to Islam. And he said this in terms at the time, and none of us took any notice of it. This, in turn, ignited political Islamism around the world. There were many Muslims who really, it wasn't even in their minds that they could establish any kind of Islamic theocracy anywhere. And suddenly there it was in Iran. And it basically gave them ideas. It certainly radicalized a lot of British Muslims virtually overnight. It turned them from people who were basically pretty apolitical and didn't have a seditious view in their heads, to people who overnight became revolutionaries, because there it was in Iran. The Iranian Revolution also galvanized the rival Saudi Wahhabis to get going. The Saudis were certainly not going to have a situation where Iran was the leader of the Muslim world. And so you had this Iranian-Saudi rivalry between the Shiites of Iran and the Sunni of Saudi Arabia. And they were fighting each other, but they were also intent on the same goal, which was to subjugate the world of unbelievers and the West to Islam, although they were going to take different routes to do so. Now, while all this radicalization was going on, Britain and Europe were experiencing a mass influx of Muslims and others as the borders of Britain and Europe opened and the